So what are Russia and Ukraine up to again? We have a report here from Politico, but overall, there are reports that have spread around the world saying that Ukrainians were able to send over 1,000 drones and missiles to Moscow, specifically 1,300 drones and missiles, which they launched at Russia, mainly targeting Moscow and, of course, the oil industry. This happened, and of course, the Russians responded to it. And they reacted to it with a lot of irritation. Some were angry at the Ukrainians, some were angry at the Russian government, and some just cried. But simply put, they reacted to it, and the point is that this attack, this big attack, was actually the biggest attack of the whole war. But we definitely can't say that it was the last attack, or that there won't be a bigger attack, or that there won't be similarly large attacks in the future. Because there will be. Because the Ukrainians managed to start mass production of all the drones that are needed and the missiles that are needed for attacks on Moscow, deep into Russia and on Russia in general several months ago. Swarm drones are crossing the Russian border much more often than in the past, and that's precisely because the Ukrainians have started mass production and are currently producing millions of small drones. That's true annually, and thousands of those larger drones which they can send into Russia every month. Therefore, they are able to harm Russia at a similar level when it comes to bombing territory with drones as the Russians do to the Ukrainians. And that's a situation that definitely puts a certain amount of pressure on Russia. Russia will have to do something about it, and the options are running out. The options are running out because, for example, they're even running short of air defense assets, the missiles they can use to shoot down those cheap drones. The Russians will probably acquire similarly effective drone shooting capabilities in the near future, just like the Ukrainians have now, by copying what the Ukrainians have already invented. So, for example, they will introduce some counter-drone drones. So in this regard, it won't be a problem for the Russians. It will be enough for them to come up with it properly, design it well, steal the plans, something like that. They built it themselves, set up the production lines, and these Ukrainian attacks will be a bit less successful again. And the Russians won't have to waste expensive S-300 and S-400 missiles on them. And they won't have to send fighter jets into the air to shoot down drones and so on. Yeah, basically where the Ukrainians are now in air defense, the Russians will be in a matter of months. However, during those months before they manage to ramp up the production of anti-drone drones and properly integrate it into their air defense, they'll have to fire expensive missiles, use costly fighter jets, and the Russians in Moscow will simply be bombed. Civilians will die because it's clear that the Ukrainians simply won't hold back anymore when it comes to attacks on Moscow. They won't hold back when it comes to attacks on warehouses, but also on production facilities, refineries, and everything else. Because, simply put, their doctrine right now is to move the war onto Russian territory as much as possible. And to assume that, based on the breakdown of the social contract, that is, that Putin ensures a good life for Russians and in return they let him rule, and based on the collapse of the narrative that the war doesn't concern Russians, the Russians might start to put pressure on Putin to end the war or to be much more willing to make concessions, to want to negotiate much more. And by that I mean really negotiate, not just dictate terms as he has done so far. So that's a certain doctrine of the Ukrainian side which may work out or may not. Of course, bringing the war onto Russian territory could also work perfectly in the opposite way. Namely, that the Russians, because of the threat to Moscow, could mobilize and rally much more around the flag and become much more determined to fight against Ukraine. On the other hand, the war has already been going on for a long time. Russians are more or less uninterested. It annoys them. It causes them economic problems, inflation, and of course, loans are extremely expensive. Often loans are given with interest rates up to 50%. Even though the official interest rate is lower, banks offer products that approach an interest level of 50%, which is practically usury. So in this respect, this is something that, combined with those attacks, could create a lot of pressure on Putin to do something, to react in some way. And here we get to a big risk of what could happen, because someone might think this is positive. Putin will end the war, right? Sure, Putin will end the war, or Russia could attack NATO within a few months, as the Polish Prime Minister stated. Of course, these are just the words of a politician, so we can't take them completely seriously, but at the same time, I wouldn't dismiss it entirely as an impossible scenario. Let's take a look inside Russia's mind and inside Vladimir Putin's mind. Why would he attack NATO if he kept dismissing it? Russia can't even defeat Ukraine. It's true that Ukraine is supported by NATO, but Russia is also supported by China and North Korea, so in that regard, it's about even. So Russia can't defeat Ukraine, and yet it would attack NATO, especially when Ukraine is currently able to bomb Moscow and will continue to be able to bomb Moscow. Why, under such circumstances, when there is more likely to be pressure to end the war or reach some agreement, would Russia attack NATO? We've talked about this in the past, and I think this scenario has become even more likely with what's happening in NATO. Specifically, the way Trump and NATO aren't cooperating, or rather how America and the rest of NATO aren't exactly in great shape or on the best terms, and considering what's happening in Iran and so on, how America is bogged down there, and given that Russia has simply reached a stage that isn't exactly good, there could be a you only live once moment, a YOLO moment, where Russia takes advantage of what it assumes is disunity in NATO and attacks Estonia. They'll use the Estonian Russian minority for some diversionary action, maybe send in a few paratroopers, occupy some Estonian islands, or, as has already been discussed, even Martin Rotha talked about it, they might attack Narva, which is a city right on the border with Russia. By the way, I have a video about the Battle of Narva, so you can watch it. It's pretty old. But the Battle of Narva took place during one of the biggest European wars, the 7 Years' War. I think it was Peter the Great against the Swedes, basically the reason why St. Petersburg was founded. However, back to the present, Estonia could be the point that the Russians attack during some quick operation. They could occupy it during a rapid action or occupy some city or some island, and at that moment Estonia would of course have to respond and invoke Article 5. And now here's the question. Of course, we can say one thing. It can't pull that off. It's not in good shape. If there was ever a situation where Article 5 might not have to be fulfilled, it's right now. And for that reason, the Russians might dare to do it. If there were a scenario where they occupy that island or they occupy Narva, or instead of Estonia, it's, say, the Suwałki corridor or something like that, if they try this and it doesn't work out, NATO will respond and bomb all those soldiers plus destroy some depots or something like that, then that would be a small price to pay for what Russia could achieve if it succeeds. Because what could Russia achieve if it succeeds? Well, they could achieve occupying the island. Estonia would call for help. NATO would start arguing and show itself as a dysfunctional alliance, basically falling apart. We would be tense with each other in Europe. Europe would be tense against America. And suddenly we would feel that the alliance doesn't actually work. That could significantly reduce support for Ukraine because we would have enough of our own problems and would be dealing with a total geopolitical crisis in our own world. And at that moment, even though Russia will somehow be bogged down in Ukraine, the ultimate goal that Russia has to mess up NATO will be achieved. Yes, so if the Russians succeeded with this attempt, with this attack, their big goal would be fulfilled, to defeat NATO. And then theoretically, they could just agree with the Ukrainians to freeze the front or something like that, and there would be a ceasefire. And Putin would come to Moscow and say, so in Ukraine we conquered a bit of Donbass, Luhansk, Crimea is ours, NATO is basically screwed, we are the fucking winners. Yeah, that's the prize Putin can win for a relatively low risk, maybe losing 1,000 soldiers that will shoot if they occupy some island or attack Estonia. And of course, because NATO is NATO and we are the way we are, we won't attack Moscow and we won't start World War III, right? So Putin isn't really risking that much and he could gain a lot. And that's why there are these concerns that something like this could happen, especially when the war in Ukraine is going so badly. They might just make that YOLO move and say, hey, let's do one last action, one last big party. If it doesn't work out, we're screwed. But if it does, man, it's going to be awesome, right? So based on that, that's why the attack could happen. And why else could the attack happen? There are a ton of reasons. Whether it's to mess with NATO or reasons like the current weakness of NATO, which even if NATO wanted to discipline Russia somehow, they really don't have a way since the Americans are exhausted because of Iran, they're weakened by Iran, and the European countries haven't really rearmed yet. So any punishment of Russia would have to fall on the Poles and the Finns or something like that. They obviously wouldn't get involved unnecessarily, so at most they'd just shoot the Russians in Narva or on some island or in Suwalki, and nothing bigger would come of it, just 1,000 dead or captured Russians, something like that. So that's another reason why they might try it, because they're really not risking anything. Even if we wanted to punish Russia in the end by taking Crimea from them or storming into Ukraine and killing all of them there, given how exhausted the Americans are from Iran and the state of European armies, military supplies, and so on, given the current geopolitical situation, the likelihood that we would actually do that is really minimal. So yeah, the Russians might try it. But look, there's still a light at the end of the tunnel that they might not even try, or that if they do try, nothing will happen that could be considered a defeat for NATO. Because we've set up two scenarios here, but that's a false dichotomy. Because it's not just a scenario where NATO falls apart and Estonia has to kick the Russians out on its own and NATO is defeated, or a scenario where NATO rises together, everyone sends troops, and together we just destroy Russia and sweep them out like cleaning out stables. All right, there's also the possibility that it could happen. So NATO will meet, sure, and it'll be like our people and we want peace, but in the end, Article 5 will be triggered. So the Czechs will send like blankets, the Americans will send greetings, and the ones who actually deploy soldiers will be the Poles, Finns, Estonians, and Swedes, yeah. Maybe the Germans will take action since they oversee the Baltic region and have deployments there. Some kind of rapid reaction force will be used, but in the end, of course, most of NATO won't actually get involved in practice, but they'll get involved by approving Article 5 and expressing diplomatic support, which doesn't cost them anything, right? Yeah. So this could easily happen. Personally, I think this is the most likely scenario, that in the end, most of NATO won't get involved. They'll leave it to the countries that are nearby, the ones that are directly affected, and they'll deal with it themselves. NATO will seem like it didn't react very well, but at least diplomatically and symbolically will remain united. Even Trump at that moment wouldn't say, I'm not going to help you. No, Article 5 won't apply. There won't be a war, nothing like that. Trump would just say at that moment, yeah, Article 5, great, we won't send anything, but great, go ahead and destroy him. That's actually what NATO is united for. So at this point, I see a kind of light at the end of the tunnel here, that this could actually be the outcome, the positive outcome, if the Russians start it, if the Russians go through with it. And for that reason, it's not certain that the Russians will actually do it, because if I'm aware of it, of course, they're aware of it too. Yeah, they realize that this could totally fall apart, break down, collapse, and it would be a huge triumph for them, and they could even end the war in Ukraine, and everything would be fine for them. They realize this. At the same time, they are very well aware that we could bomb them back to the Stone Age, but they don't give that a very high chance. And at the same time, they realize that there are plenty of other intermediate scenarios, and the very existence of those intermediate scenarios prevents them from having done it already, and it quite well reduces the chance that they'll actually do it. They realize there are many other possible scenarios. And even if it isn't 100% certain, it still isn't absolutely guaranteed to happen. Basically, if the attack were to happen, it would be because of tensions in NATO, because of the weakness of the United States and Europe. Now is the best possible time. And finally, the stockpiles are depleted. Russia is now using missiles that are produced immediately in Ukraine. In other words, they are using missiles that are made right away in Ukraine. Well, this is actually just a recycled article, right? We keep reading over and over that Russia is running out of something. It's pretty funny. And what pisses me off the most is the fact that people keep putting words in my mouth saying that Russia is running out of something and asking when it will finally run out. But I never jumped on that bandwagon saying that Russia is running out of something, that it doesn't have it and soon won't have it at all. I stopped believing that about half a year after the war started when I realized that's not how it works, you know? So, yes, right now it seems that Russia might be running out of something, or in some way their supply lines are stretched so they don't have any proper stockpiles of these missiles or something like that. But that doesn't necessarily mean they'll just run out, you know, or that their supplies are exhausted. They can increase production, they can reduce the number of missiles, they can replace them with drones. There are plenty of ways they can stockpile some missiles again. Besides that, they have quite a large number of other missiles. We know they have stockpiles of other missiles that they don't use as much in Ukraine. At the same time, we know that in Ukraine they use older military equipment, older tanks pulled out from Soviet warehouses, because that's enough for them there. Whereas the newly manufactured tanks, which they produce very few of, by the way, they don't send those new tanks to Ukraine, because they don't need that many there when it comes to armored attacks. They send them to storage. So theoretically, they're accumulating some more modern armored vehicles which they could deploy against the enemy, or on a battlefield where armored vehicles would play a much bigger role. Yeah, rather than on this battlefield. I'm not saying that equipment doesn't play any role on this battlefield. Of course it does play a role. But given the stage this battlefield is in, it basically doesn't matter for the Russians whether they send a T-90 or a T-72. Yeah, at this stage of the war, it doesn't matter. So they prefer, or even a T-60 or something. Yeah, even a T-55, in fact. Yeah, they could theoretically deploy it. And there wouldn't be such a big difference on this battlefield. So that's how it is. Yeah, look, the Russians definitely, their stockpiles aren't empty, but they definitely have an exhausted economy. They have an angry population. Moscow is being bombed. They have quite a few reasons to test NATO. Well, of course, we don't know if that's going to happen. But the very fact that we're talking about it, that we're spreading the word, that we're preparing for it, that we're showing we know about it, the very unity, rearmament, and political responsibility actually reduce the chance that it will happen, and that's why it's important. And for the same reason, it's important to support this kind of content through QR codes, through likes, shares, and comments, where you share what you think about this situation. Because, of course, by supporting this content and spreading this information, you reduce the number of people who believe nonsense. And your investment will pay off greatly in that there won't be a third world war. Yes, support this content so there won't be a third world war. Each of you who doesn't support this content basically wants war and wants a third world war, wants a nuclear fallout, right? So think about yourselves for a moment, and of course we'll continue and watch more videos. And of course, don't take this ending too seriously. Take the rest of the video seriously, as it's a serious matter. That ending about there being a nuclear war if you don't give me 100 crowns CZK is a joke, okay? It's a joke. Here's a disclaimer, since people online can be unpredictable. So that's how it is.